Well, hi everyone, and welcome to this lecture by Lauren Fair on stain reduction, hosted by the Icon Ceramics and Glass Group. I'm Lily, and I'm the student representative and social media coordinator for the group. I know that I've encountered quite a few ceramics with like persistent staining, complex decision making surrounding this, so I'm quite excited to hear all of Lauren's advice today. Lauren is the head of objects conservation at Winterthur Museum, Garden and Library, and she's also an affiliated assistant faculty for the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation. She's also the coordinator of the ICOM CC Glass and Ceramics Working Group. One of her main research interests is the stain reduction techniques for the conservation of ceramics. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Lauren.
Great. Thank you so much, Lily. And a huge thank you to Icon Ceramics and Glass Group for inviting me to speak today about one of my favorite topics, ceramic stains. And I know that this was supposed to be a workshop in person, but I'm actually quite thrilled that we can do this online and have so many people from all over the world tuning in. So thank you for being here. I'm going to cover a lot of material in this next hour, but there's also a lot that I won't be able to cover. So I'm actually going to type here in the chat my email address. And so please feel free to email me if we don't get to questions or if you have things to share afterwards. I'd love to hear from you. So let me share my screen. Does that look good? Okay. So I'd like to start today by giving you a little bit of background into the history of this work and how we've developed it over the years at Winterthur where I work. But first and foremost, I want to recognize my dear late mentor, Bruno Pouliot, who is the primary reason why I can give this talk to you today. If you knew Bruno, even tangentially, you know that the world lost an amazing human and a committed, compassionate conservator, and I dedicate this talk to him. Bruno saw the potential for collaborating with scientists at our museum and university to advance what was previously considered safely possible in ceramic stain reduction. Teaching a seminar each year within our conservation graduate program, Bruno saw a clear and effective protocol based solidly in scientific theory take form. Once I joined the museum staff and university faculty in 2012, Bruno and I worked together to continue ceramic stain reduction research and practical applications. Now, in case you're unfamiliar with our setup, Winterthur Museum collaborates with the University of Delaware to run one of 4 graduate conservation programs in the US. Winterthur is pictured above with a view of the research building and historic house behind it. It's home to 2 master's degree programs. Old College building on the University of Delaware Newark campus is pictured below. This campus is about a 30-minute drive south of Winterthur, and it is home to both undergraduate and PhD programs. Our conservation labs and where I spend most of my time are located at Winterthur. The museum collection consists of nearly 85,000 decorative art objects, including over 16,000 ceramics. A significant portion of these is on permanent display within the 175-room mansion. This is a view of Spatterware Hall with 576 English ceramics that are, you guessed it, spatterware. Most of the ceramics in Winterthur's collection date between the 17th and early 19th centuries, and this is a view of the pottery room and alcove with 320 American-made ceramics. Most of the collection comes from America, Europe, and Asia, and this is the China shop with about 422 primarily Chinese ceramics. Stain reduction is often required during the treatment of ceramics. Although the historical relevance of the stain must first be considered when making treatment decisions, stains are often disfiguring enough that they limit a full aesthetic appreciation of an object. And this is particularly true within fine arts and decorative arts collections, such as those at Winterthur. For several years, we've delved into this topic, evaluating traditionally used materials and methodologies, considering new options and approaches that are safe for the different ceramic bodies, glazes, and enamels, and testing these concepts through the treatment of dozens of ceramics. Through the process, we've developed a sequence of steps and troubleshooting tips for stain reduction that has provided safe and effective results. Knowing the nature of both ceramic bodies and the most common types of stains we might encounter are essential to designing procedures for stain reduction. This talk today will focus on the concepts and protocol that we consider as most critical to the stain reduction of ceramics, which includes the types of stains that we typically encounter and how they're held within a ceramic, the sequence of steps that we find to be most useful, and how to choose a poultice material to safely and with control optimize results. Throughout, I'm going to highlight materials old and new that have worked particularly well and showcase these through different case studies. But let's start by defining what we mean by a stain in a ceramic. It's a disfiguring material that has permeated a porous body and subsequently dried and become held within. Stains cannot be removed by surface cleaning alone. And we say stain reduction rather than removal. It should always be preceded by clearing surface dirt, deposits, and/or soluble salts. In our work, we've come to see that there are about 4 broad classes or types of stains. And as we go through them, do keep in mind that most of the time we really have a mixture of these types, and that a ceramic's history, for example, past restoration and use, will further complicate what's present. So the first category is organic stains. These often originate from simple handling and use or storage of food products, for example, sugar and milk, or tannins from tea. They may also derive from the burial environment and contain humic and/or fulvic acids from soils. Theoretically, organic stains will respond to oxidizing bleaches, acids, and alkalis. Inorganic stains are most often associated from dirt itself. Calcium is a common metal ion in most dirt and dust, as well as hard water. Other metallic species such as iron and copper alloys can be present from burial soils or from components in contact with the object, so restoration staples or rivets, or original components such as handles and other hardware. Inorganic stains respond well to chelating agents and acids. The third category are what we call greasy and oily stains, and these are most often associated with cooking or food storage, particularly of oil and fat-containing products. These can also be present in certain burial situations. And finally, there are those stains associated with past use of adhesives. Past reduction attempts can further complicate adhesive-based stainings, as solvent-based poultices can easily drive in adhesives and consolidants deeper into a porous ceramic body if not carefully controlled. These types of stains respond mostly to solvent poultices, followed by oxidative bleaches. While these general classes of stains can be useful, we must remember that most stains are some combination of organic and inorganic components, at times bound with oil or adhesive residues. So in addition to the stains themselves being ionic in nature, ceramic bodies composed mostly of silicate materials are also electrostatic. In any given environment, a silicate material can take on a net positive or net negative charge, thereby holding other ionic material to them, for instance, metallic ions or acidic organic stains. And because most clay minerals have high surface area to weight ratios, they can bind significant amounts of adsorbed molecules at their surface. This is one of the big factors as to why most stains are not removed by water alone. What this slide is demonstrating is the electrostatic forces and how stains can enter a ceramic body and be held there. Also keep in mind that length of exposure, degree of porosity of the ceramic body itself, environmental conditions, and more all play a role in how ceramic can become stained. So what do we do? The sequence of steps shown here has proven to be a successful protocol at safely and effectively reducing stains from many different kinds of ceramics as carried out at Winterthur over the past decade or more. So first, choosing a chelator. Because electrostatic forces largely hold stains to a ceramic body, starting with a chelator to target metallic components within the stain can be extremely effective. A chelator can bind with certain divalent metal cations, complexing with them, thereby allowing the complex to be washed away with water. Conceivably, this will free organic staining material that may also be held to a ceramic body by means of these electrostatic forces. It is important with all chelators to work in the pH range for which they are effective, to choose the right one to bind with the cations most likely present in your stain, and to work in low concentrations to minimize residues. So first, controlling the pH. Chelators work in a specific pH range, and that is when at least 3 of their functional groups are ionized, which is known as its pK3. And each has a measurable binding constant that can determine which ions the chelator can effectively complex with. So this diagram here is showing the speciation for the pH speciation for citric acid, our most used chelator in ceramic stain reduction. And you can see here is where 3 groups are ionized in the molecule, which corresponds to a roughly neutral pH, which is great. That's where we can use citric acid between a pH of 6 and 8, which is also safe for our ceramic materials. And here are structures of the other commonly used chelators. And here they are in a chart along with their acid dissociation constants. So it's this pK3 for each that indicates the minimum pH for which each chelator will be effective. So we can see that we have a range of pHs, some slightly acidic and some slightly more alkaline, but most around a neutral range, which can give us a little bit more options for when we're trying to combat stains. When choosing a chelator, one must also consider whether it will be effective for the estimated type of stain present. So this chart provides the formation constants, the pKf of citric acid, alongside various metallic oxides and compounds that can be common components, common inorganic components of stains. So this chart compares the pKf of citric acid complexes to the component solubility product, or the pKsp, which determine whether citric acid can effectively chelate the cation of each compound. So in other words, the pKf of citric acid must be greater than the pKsp of the compound to be an effective chelator for that cation. So here we can see that citric acid can be an effective chelator for calcium-containing compounds, most especially calcium sulfate, but will not be an effective chelator, not even close for something like iron or even copper. And please feel free to type questions in the chat or the Q&A as we go. I know that our moderators are going to be looking for those, but don't feel you have to wait till the end. And then here in this chart are the formation constants of, or the pKfs of EDTA, another commonly used chelator. So note here that EDTA is an effective chelator for calcium as well as for copper, but not so much for iron. And finally, here is the chart with formation constants of H-bed, which is an expensive but effective chelator for iron as well as other materials. The final critical factor is the ionic strength of the chelating solution, or in other words, the concentration. Too high a concentration means that we're putting unnecessary osmotic pressure on the ceramic surface as the chelator diffuses within it. This also increases the diffusion of the chelator deeper within, or can do so, creating risks for unwanted reactions and making the rinse more challenging. The most effective cleaning strategy is to use a low concentration chelator, and by this we mean as low as 0.5%, which is what I use most often now, or up to as high as 2%. We really don't need much higher than that. And then reapply that as needed, rather than working at an initially high concentration. Now, sometimes there will be a reason why we would want to initially use something a little bit higher than 2%, but I'll address that in one of our case studies later on. It's also important to consider what will happen to the reagent used if residues are left behind. Ideally, we're not leaving residues, but if we are, what's happening? And how you mix your solution could have a varying impact in this case. So for example, ammonium citrate breaks down into volatile ammonia and citric acid, which when left behind can expose the ceramic to a pH of 2 to 3 with future introduction of moisture. Sodium citrate, however, is stable and potential residues will not deliquesce into acidic components. The recipe shown here on the right is what I use to mix sodium citrate at a pH of 8.5 for most stain reduction applications. You can see that I'm adding a small amount of boric acid as a buffer. Oops. Here we go. Another reason why we recommend and use the weakest possible chelator is that it must not affect metal-containing compounds within the ceramic itself. This SEM EDX image is of a sample of overglazed enamel decoration on a lead-glazed earthenware. And it shows that when the clay, body, glaze, and enamel are fired at their respective maturation temperatures, a vitrified or glassy matrix binds the different particles together, including metal ions that often impart color. So this is a sample of an enamel that was in good condition. And you can see that the iron, which is part of the colorant in this case of a black enamel, is bound within the silicate matrix and therefore not available for chelation. However, if the body, glazes, or enamels were not fired properly, as is evident on the green enamel that's flaking on this dish, or if the ceramic has suffered deterioration through use or burial or otherwise, then one must consider modifying the sequence and avoid the use of chelators and possibly the use of bleaches as well, because these can affect the metal ions present. But otherwise, in good condition ceramics, what we're using in these low concentrations at around neutral pHs are safe and effective. So after a chelator has broken down parts of the stain, bleaching can become a necessary second step to address any of the remaining organic components of the stain that may remain. So oxidizing bleaches function in two ways. They permanently alter organic residues by making them more water soluble and by decolorizing them. The use of heat, such as an incandescent light, can help the bleaching reaction and provide better results. And if you think about like the old ladies at the salon, getting their hair bleached with the dome that comes over, that's exactly what's happening. It's providing heat to help the bleaching process. It also feels really good. And then this schematic over here on the right is just showing you the oxidation of something like an aldehyde, which could be a common component of many staining materials. And we say that the effect is permanent Here's the resulting compound. Because it can be washed away with water, and if there are residues of that stain, it can't be further oxidized by something like light or photo oxidation as it could if a reducing bleach was used. So preliminary testing, as with everything, is essential with bleaches, as oxidizing bleaches do have the potential to alter metallic components if they are present. And as we said, if there are delicate or improperly fired parts. We have mostly used two oxidizing bleaches at Winterthur, carbamide peroxide and sodium perborate. Both of these are used in the teeth whitening industry. And you'll see in some of the case studies that we're using hydrogen peroxide, carbamide peroxide, which is the one that I prefer now, is the stabilized form of hydrogen peroxide. So it's a little bit slower to break down, which gives you a more even and controlled bleaching process. And as it breaks down into carbamic acid and hydrogen peroxide, and then further into ammonia and carbon dioxide, and then both of which will volatilize. So in this way, carbamide peroxide can also serve as a first rinse for chelator residues in the chelator bleach sequence. But I will note that a final rinse with water is still necessary, as carbamide residues have been detected on objects that were not rinsed following this bleach. So because this is not a salt solution, we can use them in concentrations around 15%, and we can mix them into a clay-based gel, which is a really effective method for particularly stain reduction in cracks. But we do need to follow this up with a rinse. Which brings us to step 3, which is the critical rinsing phase. And it's, addressing any potential material that is left within the ceramic body. Since no easy method exists for evaluating the effectiveness of this rinsing phase, our approach all along the way is to minimize the depth of penetration of our reagents wherever we can, to really understand the properties of the materials that we're using, what happens to the reagent once it's penetrated, and use as low concentrations as possible. And then finally, doing a final rinse. Only a light rinse is necessary when you're, working with materials more at the surface. But if you have sort of flooded the ceramic with a lot of material, then maybe doing a more in-depth rinse will be required. All right, so we have now covered the protocol of choosing a chelator, following with an oxidizing bleach, and rinsing thoroughly. We've also discussed the importance of pH and the need to minimize residues. And now I would like to discuss an equally important component to stain reduction of ceramics, which is choosing the right poultice. And we are only talking about poultice applications here, not soaking or full immersion. Soaking treatments, while they do have their rare place, severely limit any control and present real difficulty in ensuring total clearance of residues. Poultice applications, on the other hand, can be more efficient and precise, allow for local applications, and provide greater control for the movement of your reagent and staining materials. So when selecting a poultice material, one must consider some factors as to how it should perform for the desired task. So does it need to deliver a lot of reagent and subsequently pull out and absorb a lot of staining material? Or is it more preferable in your case to deliver a small amount of reagent working primarily at the surface? So with something like agarose gel, which we'll get into, you can control the depth of the gel's reagent. The depth the gel's reagent will penetrate by controlling the pore size of the gel. We also have to think about how the poultice material will behave as it dries. So some, such as paper pulp, will maintain really good contact throughout the drying process, while others, such as K-dry tissue, which is shown here in this picture, tend to lift and kind of come away from the ceramic as it dries. It's actually really important that you have good contact throughout the drying process, especially in the final moments, which is when the visible staining material at the surface can be captured kind of in those last moments. And then finally, can you remove the poultice material safely? So laponite and other clay-based poultices, for instance, form tenacious films if they're left to dry directly in contact with the silicate structure. So you might need to consider using those over some kind of barrier layer. Other considerations are the porosity of the ceramic piece. So will you be able to diffuse a solution through a porous earthenware with a crazed lead glaze, or are you going to be limited to a few hairline cracks in a hard paste porcelain? The entry points for how the stain permeated in the first place will be the same for our treatments. And because I like to put things in categories, apparently, there's these four main categories of poultice materials that we commonly turn to. So there's ones based on cellulose, which are the paper pulps and powders, as well as different papers, so wet strength tissues and others. The gel category, which can be really far reaching, any kind of gels that we use in conservation could be applicable. Agarose is really the one that I use almost exclusively now. And then those based on clays, which could also be considered gels, but Laponite RD, which is a synthetic clay, as well as natural clay materials like sepiolite and attapulgite. These have been used as poultices in the building industry in particular, but have a lot of great uses in ceramic stain reduction. And then finally, this category of polymeric absorbents is something we've been playing with in the last decade or so. And I have I'll explain a little bit more about what those are in the next few slides. So I'm going to focus on, of these, I'm not going to go through every single option, but the ones that we most prefer, and then move on to some case studies where you can see them in action. So those based on cellulose. They're great because they're easy to use, they're inert, so you can use them with pretty much any material or any reagent. And they tend to have really good contact throughout the drying process. Now, the exception, as I said, is this K-dry, these tissues, but there are even still ways that you can use them, especially on a convex surface. Those papers will maintain good contact. Really the only disadvantage that I see is that you can have a hard time controlling the degree that the reagent will permeate. So the only way that you can really control it is subjectively how wet you're getting that poultice material or not. So paper pulp can be sourced in many places as long as it's acid-free and ash-free, or you can make it yourself by soaking filter paper, acid-free filter papers in a blender and blending it up and then letting it dry and fluffing it. And, as I said, you can use them to deliver a lot of reagent, even if it's not incredibly measurable. And it does have a really good degree of pulling power, as well as an immense ability to hold a lot of staining material into it as it dries. So it's very absorbent. And K-dry tissue, this is what we're talking about. It comes from Kimberly-Clark. They're professional Kimtech Science Kim wipes. And another option could be chromatography paper. We've been using that a lot too. I like using these papers when I only want a light application near the surface. They are incredibly absorbent and don't lose their strength when they're wet. And you'll see in a coming case study that I use them in conjunction with agarose gel when I want control, but also absorbency. So for the gels, as I said, agarose has become one of my favorite materials in ceramics stain reduction. If you've not used agarose before, it is a polysaccharide from seaweed that comes in the form of a white powder. It can be mixed with water or directly into your chelator solution and heat it in a microwave or on a hot plate until it bubbles up. Then the gel forms upon cooling into a flexible film of any desired thickness and contour. Its main advantage is that you can design the gel at a given concentration, which determines its pore structure and whether its reagent will be more or less penetrating into the ceramic. You can mix it directly into any solution that can be heated. And for those that cannot be heated, such as solvents or oxidizers, you can mix the gel in water alone and then soak it into your desired solution until the reagent diffuses, which usually takes about a couple hours only. It's also optically clear, so you can see what's happening through the gel as it's sitting on the surface. So you don't have to wait until the poultice dries to see if you've achieved desired results or something has gone terribly wrong. The disadvantage really is that it can't pull and hold stains within it. So it's not very absorbent. So you can add cellulose powder to the gel. So when you mix it up and it's heated, you can add cellulose powder to it. And I've got a case study that shows you what that looks like. But I have actually come to really like using the agarose gel alone as the delivery method and then replacing it with something like K-dry tissue for the final pulling step. And you'll see that in a little bit too. So when I'm talking about the pore size and how that relates to how the gel will want to go into your ceramic more or less, this is what I mean. So a lower percentage gel, which would be about a 1%, is going to have much bigger pores, which will be more wanting to by capillary action flow into your ceramic body. Whereas a higher percentage of gel, the 5% solution, you can't really go too much higher than 5% because it'll gel too quickly and just be difficult to work with. Although I know some people can do it. I haven't been able to do it. The smaller pore size will want to stay more in the gel and go less into the ceramic. So this way of controlling how much delivery you're going to get from this gel is a really useful tool. And then Laponite RD is the synthetic clay that I mentioned that also comes as a fine white powder. It does not require heat to mix. Rather, you slowly add it into your solution while stirring. And a magnetic stir plate works really good for this. Its main advantages are that it has the strongest pull of all the poultice materials discussed here, which makes it ideal for pulling stains out of tight cracks. It can also be mixed with solvents and carbamide peroxide. However, it cannot be mixed with salt-based compounds such as chelators or sodium perborates. These will interfere with the gelling of the clay particles. The other downside is that you can't leave it to dry directly on your silicate surface. So as we know, if you're not letting it dry, it cuts down on that final pulling during the drying out. But you can apply the gel directly as you see being done here in this image. And then as it starts to dry, you can remove it. So the pulling is still strong in that case. But another option is that you can apply the gel over a thin barrier tissue, so something like the K-dry tissue or an thin Asian paper like Gambiu Suyo. So while that initial pulling will be decreased by the barrier tissue, the pull through drying will remain really strong. And then the final material I'm going to point out here are those polymeric absorbents, and one of which is Amberlite XAD. And this is manufactured by Dow Chemical. These resins consist of round, non-ionic, inert polymers with a macroporous structure that were initially developed for the wastewater treatment industry. So it's their spherical structure that is what can capture ionic staining materials by adsorption. This is a great option if you are in a situation where you want to avoid the use of chelators, such as this flaking green enamel example that I showed you earlier. So in this case, and when you use these, they can be used in deionized water alone, and you just dampen them, which kind of forms a clump of these spheres that you then apply directly to the surface. The biggest disadvantage of these is that they're really difficult to apply. The little spheres can be unwieldy, especially as they start to dry out. They'll just kind of roll everywhere. So you really can only apply them on horizontal surfaces. So that could be limiting. All right, so I would like to now take you through some case studies that put all of this into action and demonstrate different types of stain reduction approaches. Some of these treatments were not completed by me, though I was around, and were completed some years ago. So I'll also point out how we would do certain aspects differently today. So the first of which is probably the most recent treatment, and this was done by me. And it's what I would call a straightforward stain. So the staining is light, it's extensive, but it's light and fairly diffuse. And we can really focus our treatment in the center well where the design elements are and where the stained white background is most distracting. It's an earthenware platter with a lead glaze, and the glaze is fairly crazed, so we don't have limited access for our reagents. And there are no delicate components or metal components that we need to worry about. So the approach here is to work lightly at the surface and pull out only the staining that is causing visual distraction. So for a situation like this, my go-to method now has been an agarose K-dry approach. So I hope you can see this. This is an agarose gel applied right here. And I'm using fairly thick and fairly large sheets because we have a really flat well for the area that we're working on. So this is a 4.5% gel, so a fairly high concentration that is less penetrating. And the gel has inside 2.5% sodium citrate at pH 8.5. So today, I would probably go even lower in my concentration of chelator to 0.5%, which has proven to be just as effective. So what I do is I apply the gel and I let it rest on the surface, and you can see tide lines starting to form. So you know that the stain is being moved, it's being affected. And what's really great is that you can see right through it, and you can see it moving underneath, and you can almost see it like diffusing and sometimes looking like it's disappearing. So once I feel the gel has caused all the diffusion it will, and this could be within a half an hour or it could be multiple hours, I just sort of keep checking it. The thinner the gel, the faster it's gonna dry out. So something that's fairly thick, like this one, won't dry out within a few hours. So I can kind of see what's happening. And once I feel that it's sort of moved it all that it will, I remove the gel and replace it with a slightly dampened K-dry tissue in the same chelator solution. So I'm just wetting the K-dry tissue and then blotting it out a couple times on a blotter paper so that it's damp enough to stick, but that it's not sopping wet, because then I'm just defeating the purpose of using agarose to limit penetration of the reagent. So if we go back to this image here, you can see the tide line, particularly right here on the left. You can also see those squiggle lines here. So my K-dry tissue is actually going beyond where the agarose was, so that all the stain that now has moved, this absorbent K-dry material will capture it into as it dries. So again, it's this like two-part process where I'm using the agarose to deliver the reagent and the K-dry or some paper-based material to capture it and pull it back out. So then I allow, after applying tissue all over, allowing that to dry completely. And you can see some areas where this paper has lifted while other areas are staying really nice and adhered. You can also see the amount of staining that's coming up in some areas versus others. And I've got actually a couple pieces of gel. So I'm really working like sequentially all along. So some areas will be completely reduced while others will need additional passes. And this lightly penetrating gel is really good for working locally without disturbing the surrounding areas. So after this gel K-dry sequence, and again, like going back on some areas and finessing it, I then applied K-dry tissue slightly dampened in the 20% carbamide peroxide, covered with plastic wrap. And then this is just my bench light that has an incandescent light bulb that gives a small amount of heat to encourage that bleaching reaction happening. So left it under heat and plastic for about an hour and then removed everything to air dry completely. And after a final rinse with deionized water and K-dry tissue, the platter looked really quite good. And you can see, I think you can make out that there are still a few specks of staining here and about, but it's no longer distracting to the design scheme. And looking at the verso, you can see that we really didn't touch the stain at all from the back, and that we really only worked lightly at the surface on the front side. And maybe just one thing to mention here is, if you are going to be doing a stain reduction for a client in private practice where they wanted to use the dish, this would not necessarily be the right approach to take, and one might want to consider full immersion in that case. This is really more for a museum setting where or a private collection where the piece will not be getting wet in the future, because if this platter got wet ever again, the stain would absolutely come back up through the surface. So just something that I want to make sure to point out. So the next case study is one where we're not aiming to work at the surface, but rather have really deep, extensive staining that has permeated throughout and is dark and intense. And this was treated by Linda Lennon some years ago. And although this picture is an earthenware, the glaze is not particularly crazed. So her main point of entry is really this one loss at the base. And you can actually see where somebody went and tried to get at that stain in the past and didn't get very far. So just putting the poultice right there isn't going to do it. So unfortunately, I don't have pictures of the process of this treatment, but I can explain the strategy. And I think it's a good example for this kind of stain problem. So the poultice material chosen was paper pulp. And the reason was for the larger amount of reagent that you could deliver, its ability to maintain really good contact throughout the drying process, and its ease of application. So as this underwent 3 successive poultices, I'll show you on the next slide. But as each was applied, you started a couple centimeters outside of that perimeter of the stain. And the reason for that, and then starting to progress, inward until the whole thing was covered. And the reason for that, to start outside of it, is that initially that stain is going to move wherever it wants to. So if it starts to move deeper into the ceramic, it's encountering chelator or your reagent. And so will be broken down rather than being, it's basically trying to eliminate pushing the stain further in. So I'll go to the next slide here. So basically 3 successive paper pulp poultices were applied to both the exterior and the interior of the jug. And the reason for this, again, is that she wanted to have excess reagent. So also using a slightly higher percentage of chelator here. I would probably today use a 2.5% and not ammonium citrate. I would use sodium citrate. But the higher end of the chelator concentration, so that you have, you want the chelator to act with the abundance of the stain and using potentially more than we need, but directing the movement and drying where we want it to go. So it's really the poultice material that is very important, the application of, and then the drying of it. And then following the chelator with 2 successive bleach poultices, here using hydrogen peroxide, I'd probably do carbamide today, using the same application strategy with paper pulp. And then finally, doing a light rinse with K-dry tissue and water. So as you can see, the results of this treatment were truly excellent. While an abundance of reagent was used, the poultice material and application strategy were what allowed for a successful reduction. And in this instance where you're using a lot of reagent, allowing the jug or the object to completely dry out in between each step is really important. And so because material was applied on the interior, they actually utilized a small fan to help encourage drying on the inside, because a narrow-necked vessel like this one will dry out much more slowly from the inside. All right, and the final case study that I'm going to share today is an example of a stubborn stain that has a mixture of components, hydrophilic and hydrophobic, thereby really complicating our go-to chelator bleach rinse sequence. This is an earthenware dish with colored slips and lead glaze on the front side. And here's a close-up of the disfiguring dark stains around the figures. And this was treated by Bruno maybe 5 years ago. So Bruno first started with an application of sodium citrate and paper pulp using a slightly higher concentration to consume the deep dark staining. So wanting to use something that maintained good contact, delivered a lot of reagent, was a higher concentration, since we know just by looking at this, the staining is pretty intense. And the cleaning results were not that great. They were patchy and disfiguring, even though there was overall lightening. And subsequent tests showed that the chelator was really not having any more effect. So we surmised here that this is an example of a greasy, oily based stain, likely from this dish being used for cooking, where the stains have almost literally become baked in. So we haven't discussed solvents too much, but they can definitely be a useful tool in stain reduction. And it's even better to use a solvent that is also a chelator, like acetalacetone. So here, Bruno mixed a 1% agarose gel, which means it's a lower percentage gel and much more deeply penetrating. And he added cellulose powder to the gel. So that's why these look all white and slightly puffy, because they're gels that have cellulose powder in them. And this was so that the gel could dry on the surface and theoretically absorb the stain more into it. The cellulose bulk gel was then soaked in 20% acetylacetone for several hours, thereby creating an acetylacetone agarose gel. So the top is the wet gel applied in the main stained areas. And then here on the bottom is where it's dried out. And you can see that it didn't really maintain good contact surface in this concave bowl. And there was some limited effect, but the treatment was stopped at this point because the dish had to go on exhibit. And here's where we rely on really good exhibit lighting team to make our treatments look okay. But 2 years later, when the piece came off view, treatment resumed. And as the acetylacetone was proving somewhat promising, Bruno continued with another round of the agarose solvent gel. And that's what you see here. But this time, even though there is a small amount of paper pulp in this gel, this time he replaced the gel before drying fully with damp paper pulp for that final pulling and absorbing step. So just like we were doing with the K-dry tissue. And this was repeated once more. And in all rounds, you can see that both the dried pulp and the dried cellulose bulked gel are pulling staining material into it. So we know that the staining is being moved. But the results were still pretty patchy on the surface. And after these 2 applications, acetylacetone seemed to stop moving the stain. So it was back to spot testing. And this revealed that now the chelator bleach sequence with a water ethanol rinse in between them was going to be effective. So we believe that the acetylacetone broke down as much of the greasy components as it could, and now allows for a more traditional chelator bleach rinse sequence to work. So here is the agarose sodium citrate gel applied in the top image. This time it's not bulked with any cellulose powder because then he's replacing it with K-dry tissue here in the bottom image. And the results yielded an overall lightening of the stain, but some diffuse spreading happened across the body, but the stain is definitely being moved. So because the ethanol water rinse showed to be effective in the spot testing, this was applied in K-dry tissue all over. The theory is that any remaining greasy components that still might be there will be picked up. And then the final step is the carbamide peroxide in paper pulp, covering it with plastic and with low heat for the first few hours, then uncovering and letting dry. And after the first round, lightening was immediately apparent, but some stain had migrated. And so a final bleach application was carried out, and the results were excellent. So here is the dish before this, at the very beginning of treatment on the left, and the very end of treatment on the right. And then on the left here is when it came back after that hiatus on exhibit for comparison. So this case study is probably one of those rare cases that you might encounter, but I think it demonstrates how not only the use of solvents can be effective, but how a strategy can really shift once you sort of targeted one part of the stain. Now you can go after another, and how testing at various points can truly be successful. So we hope, I hope, that many conservators will consider the proposed sequence of steps for stain reduction on ceramics and begin to test it out using the methods and materials presented, and also trying some new ones. Each stained ceramic requires careful consideration and its own treatment protocol based on testing and observations. With our approach, which we do teach to our students every year, allows for a sequential and logical selection of materials, offering a good likelihood for a successful outcome while minimizing risks for unwanted results. Our wish is that those who try these techniques, materials, and sequence proposed will then share their observations with others. To this effect, we have presented over the years advanced seminars in the US to conservators at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Walters, the Lunder Conservation Center, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and the Strauss Center at Harvard. And we presented this research at the ICOM-CC Glass and Ceramics interim meeting in Amsterdam in 2013. At our seminars, participants test out the protocol on stained ceramic study pieces utilizing different reagents. concentrations, and poultice materials. And we do plan to offer more of these seminars in the future, hopefully next year in London. I believe stain reduction on ceramics can be achieved safely and successfully with a strong understanding of the properties of ceramics themselves, chelators, bleaches, and poultices. This will not happen without a few setbacks and the discovery yet to come of new modified materials that work better in certain cases. So as you continue this work, we welcome your comments and ideas. And with that, I just want to thank you so much for your kind attention today. And I'm happy to take questions and have discussions. And of course, you can always feel free to reach out to me after. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was really insightful. And I feel like I've learned a lot. I'm really excited to hopefully be able to use some of those techniques next year at the workshop. Yes, so we have a few questions so far. So if anyone has any more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A box. So our first question is, if the chelator is very much higher than the pK for the iron chosen, would that make it dangerous? So would it be appropriate to use the iron chelator for everything, or would we want to keep the pKs close?
Yeah, that's a good question. I fear I don't know enough with my chemistry to know if it's dangerous or what the negative consequences would be, but I definitely would say to not just go for the big guns if you don't need them. And sort of related, but not really, just one thing I didn't have time to mention is that HBED and Tyron, which are both specific for chelating iron, Tyron is less expensive. They both form pink complexes when they chelate iron, which can actually be a challenge, and you can have pink staining as a result. So that's not great. But no, I would definitely start with these sort of what I think of as less strong chelators and work your way up only as needed. But I'm afraid I don't have the true chemical understanding of why.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. We also have a couple of questions about agarose. So one participant says, I usually work with laponite whilst always using a Japanese paper barrier. Would you use a barrier when working with agarose?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Because when I first started using agarose, I was letting it dry on the surface. And that's when I learned very quickly that it isn't a good absorber. It'll pull, but then not be able to really hold it into the gel. And so what you get is the stain sort of depositing right there at the interface. And it can actually make the stain look more exaggerated, which fortunately you can pick it up pretty easily after that, but was a little disconcerting to learn at first. And sometimes I know people have said that if they let agarose dry on a glazed surface, it can be a challenge to get it off. I haven't personally experienced that, but either way, I really wouldn't be letting it dry on the surface. I would just be using it, as I said, as a delivery method, and then replacing it. And when we have added cellulose powder to the gel, removal is never an issue. It comes up right away. So it's like, I think that makes it very different character.
Yeah, that's good to hear. And the second question is, what do you do with the used up agarose? Is it reusable in any way? The participant said that they could be wrong, but they heard that there were some sustainability concerns with the use of algae a few years ago.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And, I have to be honest, we haven't experimented with reusing it. But I do believe that we can. And actually, one of my students this year is looking at agarose and doing some aging studies, because we've encountered an artist who works with agar as her primary medium. And I know that there are a lot of artists out there who are working with algae-based gels and other bioplastics as well. And she was telling us that she absolutely, remelts them down. So it's something that I think we probably should be doing, but we have to figure out how to kind of clear them out. And I have not experimented with that. So if anyone has, I would love to hear about it. But yeah, I think it's definitely possible.
Yeah.
And there are sustainability issues for sure.
Yeah, I guess it's definitely good to be thinking about these things and working towards it.
Mm-hmm.
One attendee says that amber light didn't seem a very good option. What reason would make you choose it over using paper pulp?
Yeah, it's really where, like in that instance, I actually had the case study included in my talk, but then I didn't want to make it so long. But we did encounter, we have a whole set of dishes that have flaking, all the green enamel in them is flaking. And chelators were used years ago with paper pulp. And we found that there were these white crystals that were forming, particularly on the green enamel, even though the paper pulp hadn't been applied directly on the enamel itself. And when those were analyzed, we found them to contain lead, silica, and I think copper as well. So it was components of the enamel. And so after some more testing and analysis, we realized that even if you protect the enamel with something like cyclododecaine so that no evaporation can occur there, if you have a really delicate or flaking or unstable component, you do run the risk of having chelators be able to interact with those materials. So something like this amberlite resin which just is in water alone, could be really effective. And on those dishes, that's actually what we are using, because we can use them flat and they're not a, completely complicated surface. So, they do have their limits, but again, I think there's room for experimentation with these and like figuring out if there's ways to optimize their application.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's something we could maybe look into at the workshop as well next year.
Yeah.
And in a similar vein, did you use Arbocell BBW40 or 200?
No, I don't know what that is.
I think that might be a brand difference. It's a paper pulp. I think it's depending on how fine the paper is, but I'm not sure
Okay.
that distinction. Maybe we can find out when at the workshop. I know that for the workshop, when we were looking at all of the materials, we did have a few discrepancies in the brand names. So
Yeah. Yeah, I know. And I'm happy to share any material information and where we source them. But of course, it might be different country to country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I've got another question that says, have you ever come across purple or brown staining caused by gilding? And if so, have you had any success at reducing it?
So I think I know what you're talking about, where it's, but maybe elaborate if I'm misunderstanding, where sometimes the gilding has been worn away and you sort of have a ghost of purple left behind. If that's what you're talking about, I think that's just an artifact of the gold ions, just being fired into the glaze. And so I wouldn't ever try to remove that. I think it's just part of the original manufacture. But maybe there's something else that you're thinking of that I don't know what you're talking about.
I guess if you can expand on that in the chat, I can ask Lauren later. But just to move on, could you use amber light in conjunction with a paper pulp to try and bind the small balls?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we have tried it. Actually, we didn't try it with paper pulp. We added amberlite resin to agarose gel. And it worked. It did stuff. I haven't done a formalized experiment to compare with and without, but yes is the answer. And it kind of the spheres, like we were questioning, will the spheres, be would their structure be able to interact if they're bound in a gel? But I do think that they form sort of a film, like they disperse throughout the gel, but they're still in contact at the edge. So yes, I do think that's possible. I haven't tried it in paper pulp.
Okay. You mentioned that agarose can be used with a solvent without heating. Could you further explain that?
Yeah, so I've had good success with mixing agarose in water. And then because the gel has these evenly distributed pores and the stability to have diffusion happen within it, you can put your gel blocks into the solution of solvent and you'll have diffusion happening. So while you won't have maybe a 100% acetone gel, you'll have some amount of water in there as well. You will have acetone in the gel after you've left it for some time. And I know that others have used agarose as a way to measure conductivity of surfaces in a similar way. So you can put that on the surface and salt diffusion can happen into it. I don't know how effective it is or how accurate you're measuring the conductivity of that surface, but diffusion is one of the properties of this gel that I think is really useful.
Great, thanks for explaining. And another question is, have you used nanogels? And if so, how do you think they compare to agarose?
I have not used nanogels. And last year, right before COVID, we had some ordered and got some into the lab, but I have not played with them yet. So would love to hear if people are using that for ceramic stain reduction.
I know that at the UCL lab, we did try to order some nanogels, so that could be a possibility for the workshop as well, which would be great.
Perfect.
And we've got some questions on the Q&A as well. So what strategies do you use to prevent tide line formation in more porous ceramic bodies during stain reduction?
Yeah, so it's a good question and not a straightforward answer because it's going to vary. But one way is, in the case study I showed you, the very first one, the platter, working just at the surface like that will really limit tide lines. I mean, you saw some forming, but tide lines aren't necessarily a bad thing. If you have them, you know that it means you're moving the stain. And because if you are controlling your poultice where you're applying it, you'll be able to capture that stain. So working at the surface and being minimal is going to minimize tide lines. If you have to use a lot of reagent, like in the example I showed with the pitcher, where you have a lot of stain, it's very intense, and you need to use a lot of reagent to get at it, using a slightly higher concentration of chelator, and then strategically applying the poultice so that it goes beyond where that stain is, and then really forcing where it's going to dry, that will definitely help with that. And all of these things, testing is important. So if you have, it's your first time trying this out, I think doing a small test on a discrete area would be important so you can see how it reacts. That being said, a small test isn't going to give you when it's time to really apply on the whole thing.